The winter that Alice Townsend arrived in Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory, the temperature dropped 17 degrees in a single afternoon, as if the land itself were warning her to turn back before it was too late. She did not turn back. She stepped off the stagecoach with one leather traveling trunk, a carpet bag stitched along one side where the seam had begun to pull loose, and a letter folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth at the creases. The letter bore a name, Perry Sullivan, and an address, Sullivan Ranch, Harrow Creek, Wyoming territory, and very little else by way of warmth or welcome. It had arrived at her boarding house in Philadelphia 3 months ago in an envelope sealed with plain wax, not even pressed with a ring or a stamp, as though the man who sent it could not be bothered with ceremony. The letter had read in its entirety, "I require a wife who can cook, manage a household, and endure the winters here without complaint. I have 340 acres, cattle, a sound roof, and no patience for nonsense. If this arrangement is agreeable to you, arrive before December." P. Sullivan. Alice had read it twice, folded it carefully, and written back the same evening to say she would come. Her friends had thought she was desperate. Her aunt had wept. Her former employer, a stout woman named Mrs. Garnett who ran a millinery shop on Chestnut Street, had told her plainly that any woman who would travel 2,000 miles to marry a stranger who called himself Cold in his own advertisement deserved whatever she got. Alice had smiled, thanked Mrs. Garnett for 3 years of employment, and spent the next 6 weeks arranging her passage west. The reasons she came were her own, private and layered as winter clothing, but they had to do with the fact that she was 24 years old, and had been surviving for as long as she could remember rather than living, and she had decided that survival without purpose was just a slow and polite way of disappearing. The advertisement Perry Sullivan had placed in the Philadelphia Matrimonial Gazette had not promised love. It had not promised comfort or companionship, or any of the soft things women were supposed to want. It had promised land, a sound roof, and no nonsense, and Alice had found herself reading that last phrase over and over again, thinking that a man with no patience for nonsense was at least a man with standards, and that was more than she could say for most of the people she had known in Philadelphia. So she came. Harrow Creek was not a large town. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 long ridges of pine-covered hills, and the main street ran about 4 blocks with a general store, a livery stable, a post office that also functioned as the telegraph office, a saloon called the Broken Spur, a church with a bell that cracked when it rang in cold weather, and a doctor's office above the barber shop. The people who watched Alice climb down from the stagecoach that December afternoon were not many, but they were curious. She could feel the weight of their attention like a second coat. You, the Sullivan bride. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Dooley, had already hauled her trunk down without being asked. He was looking at her with something between sympathy and admiration. "I am Alice Townsend," she said. "Is Mr. Sullivan here to meet me?" Dooley scratched the back of his neck and looked down the street. "He said he'd come. Perry Sullivan's not a man who says things he doesn't mean." She stood in the cold and waited. The wind came down off the ridge and pushed through her wool coat as if it were made of gauze, and she kept her chin level and her eyes on the far end of the street where the road curved toward the hills, because she had learned a long time ago that looking uncertain in front of strangers only invited their pity, and she had no use for pity. He came 10 minutes later. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a horse moving at a deliberate, unhurried pace on the frozen road, iron shoes ringing against the hard ground. The horse was a dark bay with a white star between its eyes, big through the chest and steady in its movement, and the man on its back was large enough to match it. Perry Sullivan dismounted in a single motion that suggested long practice and no wasted effort, looped the reins over the hitching post in front of the general store, and walked toward her. He was 32 years old, tall and broad in the shoulders, with dark hair that showed beneath the brim of a black hat he wore pulled low against the cold. His jaw was set hard and square, His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of January sky before a storm, and his expression was arranged in a way that suggested he had decided some time ago not to give it away unless absolutely necessary. He wore a heavy canvas coat and worn leather boots, and he moved as though the cold and the wind and the frozen ground were things he had made a private arrangement with long ago and did not need to remark upon. He stopped 3 feet from her and looked at her with those gray eyes in a manner that was neither rude nor welcoming. It was the look of a man assessing something important. "Alice Townsend," he said. It was not a question. "Perry Sullivan," she answered in the same tone. Something shifted in his expression, the smallest thing, almost nothing, but she caught it. Then it was gone. "Trunk?" he asked. "One trunk and the carpet bag." He picked up the trunk as if it weighed nothing, tied it to the back of his saddle with a length of rope he produced from a saddlebag, and took the carpet bag from her hand without asking. Then he looked at her coat. "That won't do out here," he said. "I beg your pardon. The coat. It's not enough for a Wyoming winter. We'll stop at Hankins' store and get you something heavier." He said it the way he might say they needed to stop for flour. Not unkind, exactly, but absent of any warmth, any acknowledgement that she had just traveled 2,000 miles to marry him and might have appreciated a word of greeting beyond a comment about the inadequacy of her outerwear. Alice looked at him for a moment. "That is very practical of you," she said. She could not be certain, but she thought the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. Just for a second. Hankins' general store smelled of cedar and tobacco, and the particular dry warmth of a cast iron stove burning pine wood. The man behind the counter, a short and round-faced fellow who introduced himself as Luther Hankins, looked at Alice with open curiosity and at Perry with the careful neutrality of a man who had long ago learned not to try to read him. "Heavy coat for the lady," Perry said, setting the carpet-bag on the counter. Luther showed Alice 3 options. She chose the one that was plainest and warmest, a heavy sheepskin-lined canvas coat that came to her knees, and Perry paid for it without discussion, which surprised her enough that she said so. "I'm not going to argue about who pays for a coat that will keep you from freezing on my property," Perry said, in a tone that suggested arguing about it would fall firmly under the category of nonsense. Alice decided that was fair and put the coat on over her wool one, and immediately felt better, and was honest enough with herself to admit it. They rode out of Harrow Creek in the late afternoon light, Alice seated behind him on the big bay horse, because there had been no other arrangement made, which was itself an indication of how little social nicety had gone into the planning of this marriage. She sat upright and kept her hands folded in her lap for the first mile, and then the road dipped into a hollow where the wind came from a new direction and the horse sidestepped, and she grabbed the back of his coat instinctively. He steadied the horse without comment. She did not apologize. He did not remark on it. But she kept her grip on his coat after that, because the road was long and the horse was bigger than any she had ridden near, and there was no point in pride when pride served no practical function. The Sullivan Ranch was 3 miles from town, set at the edge of a long open meadow with the Pine Ridge rising behind it. As they came over the last rise and the house came into view, Alice was quiet for a moment, looking. The house was solid. That was the first word that came to her. It was a 2-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide covered porch along the front and a stone chimney at each end, both of them sending up thin trails of smoke that bent sideways in the wind. The barn was large and well kept. The fences along the corral were straight and tight-strung, and there was a kitchen garden visible along the south side of the house, bare now but laid out with evident care. Around the house stood several old cottonwood trees, enormous and gray-limbed in winter, and behind the house the land opened into the broad meadow where she could see dark shapes of cattle moving against the snow. "It's a good property," she said, because it was, and she believed in saying true things. "I've been working it for 8 years, Perry said. Nothing else." They dismounted near the barn. A young man of perhaps 19 came out to take the horse. She would learn his name was Eli Prout, Perry's only hired hand, a quiet boy from Texas who had drifted north 2 years ago and stayed because Perry paid him fair and fed him well and did not require conversation. Inside the house was warm and clean. Perry showed her the kitchen first, large, with a good cast iron cookstove, a long pine table, shelves stocked with preserved goods, and a window above the sink that faced the mountains. Then the sitting room, which had a stone fireplace and 2 chairs and a bookshelf with perhaps 30 volumes, which was more than she had expected. Then upstairs, 2 bedrooms. "You'll have the east room," Perry said, standing in the doorway of a room that held a bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window that would catch the morning light. "My room is across the hall." She nodded. The arrangement was sensible and she had expected nothing else. This was a business arrangement made by letter between 2 practical people, and she would have been a fool to expect anything warmer than what he had already offered, which was a warm house, a sound roof, and the sense that he meant to keep his word about what he'd promised. "Thank you," she said, "for the room, for the coat, for coming to meet me." He was already halfway to the stairs. He paused, his hand on the door frame, not turning all the way around. "You came a long way," he said. It was the least that was owed. Then he went downstairs, and she stood in the east room with the last light of the December afternoon coming through the window, and she thought that this was going to be a very interesting winter. The wedding was held 4 days later, on a Thursday morning, at the Cracked Bell Church in Harrow Creek, performed by Reverend Oakes, a thin man with kind eyes who had seen enough of the territory's particular brand of practical matrimony not to remark on the brevity of the acquaintance. There were 2 witnesses, Luther Hankins from the general store and Eli Prout, who had cleaned himself up considerably for the occasion and looked acutely uncomfortable in a collar. Alice wore the blue dress she had brought for the purpose, not a wedding dress by any conventional standard, just a good wool dress in deep blue that had cost her a month's wages at the millinery shop, and which she considered worth every cent because it fit her well and blue suited her dark hair and fair skin. Perry wore a dark coat she had not seen before and had clearly made an effort of some kind, though his expression remained that same carefully neutral arrangement. He seemed to have made a permanent fixture. Reverend Oakes asked them the words, and they said the words, and Perry slid a plain gold band onto her finger, purchased, she would later learn, from Luther Hankins' display case that same morning. And when Reverend Oakes said Perry might kiss his bride, there was a pause of approximately 2 seconds during which Alice kept her eyes steady, and Perry looked at her with those pale gray eyes and then bent and pressed his lips to her cheek. Brief, formal, and very cold from the winter air. Luther Hankins gave them a jar of honey as a wedding gift. Eli Prout shook Perry's hand and nodded to Alice with a shy decency that she liked immediately. On the ride back to the ranch, the temperature had dropped further and snow was beginning. Not a storm, just the quiet, patient, relentless kind of snowfall that the Wyoming winter seemed to specialize in, coming down in fine white grains that gathered in the brim of Perry's hat and on the shoulders of Alice's new sheepskin coat. She sat behind him on the bay horse again, and this time she did not wait for the horse to sidetrack before she put her hands around his waist, because they were married now and it was cold, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. He did not say anything about it. But she felt the small change in how he held himself, not a pulling away, more a slight settling, as though something had been adjusted and found, perhaps unexpectedly, to be all right. The first weeks were careful and quiet, like the snow. Alice learned the house and the house learned her. She was a good cook, genuinely good, not in the polite way women described themselves, but in the way that showed she had been paying attention to the chemistry of food and heat and timing for years. She had kept house for her aunt after her parents died of typhoid when she was 14, and she had cooked for paying boarders at Mrs. Garnett's suggestion for 3 years after that, and she knew what she was doing at a stove. The first morning she made biscuits and gravy and set a proper breakfast on the long pine table and called Perry in from the barn. He sat down, ate without speaking, and then looked at the empty plate as if it had surprised him. "You can cook," he said. "I said I could," she replied, bringing the coffee pot to the table. "People say things," he said. "I do not say things I cannot do," she told him. Then she sat down across from him and poured her own coffee, and picked up one of the 30 books from the sitting room shelf. She had seen that they were a fair mix of practical volumes on cattle ranching and land management, and a handful of novels, and a book of poetry she had not expected and read while she drank her coffee, and he watched her do this without speaking, and that was the shape of their first breakfast. Over the following weeks she established herself in the kitchen and the house with quiet competence. She organized the pantry shelves, which had been arranged in the manner of a man who never threw anything away, but also never looked for anything twice in the same place. She mended the curtains in the sitting room where the hem had pulled loose. She found that the root cellar had excellent potential for additional preserves, and began a mental inventory of what she would want to put up come spring and summer, which meant she was already thinking about spring and summer, which meant she had already made her decision about this place, if she was honest with herself. Perry worked from before dawn to after dark most days, which was not unusual for a working cattle ranch in winter. There was feeding to be done, fences to check, the general vigilance that livestock required against the cold and the predators that came down from the hills in hungry months. He came in for breakfast and supper without fail, and ate with the concentrated attention of a man who genuinely valued a good meal, and he thanked her each time, simply and without embellishment, which she found she respected more than extravagant praise would have been. But they were strangers in a house, and the distance between them was real and particular, the kind of distance that forms between two careful people who are each waiting to see what the other is made of before they extend themselves. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn the country by traveling it slowly. He rose at 4:30 each morning and made coffee before he went to the barn, and he always left a cup on the back of the stove for her, covered with a plate to keep the heat. This was a small thing, and she noticed it the very first morning and said nothing about it, but she thought about it. He did not waste words, but the words he used were always precise and honest, and she came to value that. There was no performance in him, no social layer of pleasantries stretched over something else. When he said something, he meant exactly it, no more and no less. He read at night. After supper, in the sitting room by the fire, he would read for an hour or sometimes 2 before he went to bed, and she sat in the other chair and read as well, and these evenings were perhaps the most genuinely companionable time they had, because they were not required to speak, and so they could simply be two people existing peaceably in the same warm room with a good fire, and that was something. She discovered the book of poetry on the shelf was well worn, its spine cracked and pages soft with handling, and one evening she asked him about it. "Walt Whitman," he said, without looking up from whatever he was currently reading. "I know who it is," she said. "I was asking if you like it." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother had it," he said finally. "She read it to me when I was young. It stayed." It was the first personal thing he had told her. She registered it carefully and did not press. She learned from Luther Hankins, who was a genuinely friendly man, and the town's most reliable source of information, which in a place the size of Harrow Creek made him something like the town historian, that Perry Sullivan had come to Wyoming territory 8 years ago at age 24 alone, with a land claim and enough money to build the barn before he built the house. He had come from Colorado, before that from Missouri, and before that no one in Harrow Creek knew for certain. He had built the ranch by working it harder than most men were willing to work, and he had managed it well, and he had built a reputation in the territory as a man who was reliable, honest in his dealings, and absolutely impenetrable as a human being. "Coldest man in the territory," Luther said, with a cheerful lack of malice. He was packaging dried beans while he spoke, and he weighed them on his counter scale with the practiced ease of long habit. "That's what folks say. Not mean cold. Just far away, like a mountain, Pretty enough to look at, not much interested in letting you in. Has he ever had friends? Alice asked. Luther considered this. He's close with Doc Mercer, I suppose. They play chess on Friday evenings at the Doc's office. Have for years. But even the Doc says Perry Sullivan is the most private man he's ever known, and Doc Mercer has been a physician for 30 years and has seen people at their most open. Alice bought her flour and salt and 2 yards of flannel and walked back to where Eli Prout was waiting with the wagon, and she thought about mountains and what it took to understand them. The first real conversation, the first one that went beneath the surface, that broke through the careful politeness they had been maintaining like two people keeping a formal contract, happened on a Friday evening in January, approximately 6 weeks after her arrival. Perry had come in from checking the north fence in a mood she could not quite read, quieter even than usual, his face set in a way that suggested something had happened or something was weighing on him that he was working through by himself, as was apparently his habit. He ate supper. She had made a beef stew with the root vegetables from the cellar and cornbread with the last of the good butter in silence, thanked her in his usual way, and went to the sitting room. She washed the dishes and then went in and sat in her chair with her book, and the fire was good and the room was warm and the snow was coming down thick outside the window, and she could hear the wind in the cottonwoods, and it was a deeply quiet and somehow very lonely evening. After a while she put her book down. Perry, he looked up from his. Are you all right? She asked. You seem, I don't know, something is on your mind. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes, and she thought he was going to say that nothing was on his mind or simply look back at his book, and she had prepared herself for that. But he did not. Clementine, he said. The word came out like something he had kept somewhere and was not entirely sure he wanted to bring into the light. I'm sorry. The name of the North Meadow where the old fence runs. I had a horse by that name when I first came to this land. Chestnut mare, good heart, bad habit of testing fences. She got out one night in the first winter and I didn't find her for 3 days, and by then she had gone down in a ravine. He stopped. He looked at the fire. I found her today when I was checking the fence line, what was left of her. A winter can preserve things a long time out here. I recognized the marking on her foreleg. Alice was quiet for a moment. How long ago? She asked. 7 years. And you still knew her. You know the things that were yours, he said, even after years. She thought about her parents, about the small house in Philadelphia where she had grown up, about the smell of her mother's kitchen in summer. Yes, she said, you do. He looked at her, then really looked, in a way he had not done before, or not that she had noticed, and something in the landscape of his face changed very subtly, the way a light changes in a room when a cloud passes. You lost people, he said. It was not a question. My parents, she said. When I was 14, typhoid. I'm sorry, he said, and it was the plainest, most genuine expression of condolence she had ever received because it had nothing performative about it. He meant it exactly. I managed, she said. I'm good at managing. I can see that, he said. They sat with the fire between them for a while longer, and when they went to bed that night the house felt slightly different than it had before. Not warm, exactly. That would take more time, but less distant. Like two strangers who had each shown the other one real thing about themselves, and found it had not killed them. February arrived with a blizzard. It came in fast from the northwest, the way the serious winter storms did in Wyoming territory, with a speed and intensity that turned the world white inside of an hour. Alice was in the root cellar taking stock of the remaining preserves when the light at the top of the cellar steps suddenly changed, and she came up to find the sky had gone the color of a wool blanket, and the wind was already screaming across the meadow, with the kind of conviction that meant it intended to be there for a while. Perry was nowhere in sight. Eli had ridden to town 2 days ago to pick up supplies and had not yet returned, which had begun to worry her before the storm and worried her considerably more now. She went to the barn, checked on the horses and the milk cow and the chickens in the attached coop, filled the water troughs from the well pump inside the barn. Perry had installed a hand pump inside for exactly this reason. She had discovered and secured the barn doors as best she could. She was back in the house, building up the kitchen stove against the coming cold, when Perry came in, preceded by a wall of freezing air that slammed the back door shut behind him. He was snow-covered from hat to boot and moving fast, stripping off his outer coat at the door. "How bad?" she asked, already moving to pour him coffee. "Bad enough. Could be 2 days, could be 4. He took the coffee and drank it standing up, still cold from outside. "Cattle in the south pasture are sheltered behind the ridge. They'll be all right, Eli. Not back from town yet." His expression tightened. "He'll stay at Hankins if he has any sense. Luther will take him in." He looked around the kitchen, taking stock as she had done, the automatic inventory of a man who had survived these winters before. "We have enough wood. I brought in 3 armloads before I saw the sky change," she said. "And there's more in the side shed, accessible from the back porch." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing look she was beginning to know. "Good thinking," he said. "I grew up reading about Wyoming territory," she said, which was not entirely true but was close enough. She had read everything she could find after she answered his advertisement, because she had never been one to walk into things unprepared. "I knew what the winters were." "Still came," he said. "Still came," she agreed. They were snowbound together for 3 days. It was, Alice would later think, when everything began to truly change. Confined by the storm, without the option of work outside to occupy him and create the physical distance he habitually maintained, Perry Sullivan was forced into proximity. And proximity, as Alice had believed and now discovered to be true, was the great dissolver of deliberate coldness. Not because it forced intimacy, but because it accumulated evidence. It was very difficult to maintain a stance of permanent remove from a person you watched making bread from scratch in a warm kitchen while the blizzard screamed outside, or sitting across a chessboard from you. She had found the chess set on the sitting room shelf and suggested it one afternoon, and he had looked at her with the mildest surprise, as if he had not expected her to know chess, or reading poetry aloud because she had picked up the Whitman volume and said, without ceremony, that she was going to read some of it and he was welcome to listen or not, as he preferred. He had listened. She read Song of the Open Road because it seemed appropriate, and then I Sing the Body Electric because she liked it, and she read well, with the understanding of someone who had been reading aloud to herself in rooms alone for most of her life. And when she finished and looked up, Perry Sullivan was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before and could not quite name. "My mother used to read exactly like that," he said, quietly, the storm making its noise against the windows. Not performing it, just meaning it. "It deserves to be meant," Alice said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She died when I was 16, my mother, fever in Colorado. It was just the 2 of us after my father went." Alice did not move, did not make any sudden gesture that might make him feel he had said too much. "Where did he go?" she asked carefully. Perry looked at the fire. "He left," he said. "When I was 11, went to California to find gold and never came back. My mother wrote to him twice. He answered once." Alice absorbed this, understanding now the geography of the man across from her, the distance, the self-sufficiency, the absolute refusal to need anything from anyone, because he had learned very young that the people you needed were the people who had the power to go away. "I see," she said quietly. "I don't say that for pity," he said, with a flare of something immediate and defensive in those gray eyes. "I know you don't," she said. "I'm not offering it, I'm listening. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled. The wind outside was enormous and wild and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the warm room. "You're different from what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. She could see him thinking, not reaching for a polite answer but an accurate one. "Someone who needed more reassurance than I was able to give," he said. "Most people do. I've found I'm not good at giving the things people want." "Maybe people want the wrong things," Alice said. "I don't need reassurance. I need honesty and reliability and someone who doesn't play games. You've given me all 3. "That's a very practical list," he said. "I'm a very practical person," she said. "But I am not only practical." He looked at her, and she held his gaze, and something passed between them that was real and had weight to it and did not vanish after a moment. Then he picked up his book, and she picked up hers, and they sat by the fire for the rest of the evening in the comfortable silence of two people who have found, somewhat to their mutual astonishment, that they fit together in the same space. On the second day of the blizzard, she found him standing at the sitting-room window late in the morning, watching the white nothing outside. The storm had not let up. The world beyond the glass was pure wind and snow, and standing there watching it, with his arms crossed and his face in profile, he looked very large and very alone in a way that caught at her unexpectedly. She brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him at the window, and they looked at the storm together. "Does it ever bother you?" she asked. "The isolation?" "Not usually," he said. "I chose it." "There's a difference between choosing to be alone and actually wanting it," she said. He was quiet for a while. "Then, when I first came here, I liked it. The quiet, the land. No one to disappoint or be disappointed by." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "After a few years, I stopped thinking about it. It just became the way things were." "And now," she said. He looked at her sidelong with those pale, clear eyes that were so much more expressive than he seemed to know. "Now," he said, "I find the house less quiet." "Is that good or bad?" she asked. A pause. "I'm still working that out," he said, but the corner of his mouth moved in that almost smile she had begun to watch for, and she decided that was a perfectly acceptable answer. On the third day the storm began to ease, and by afternoon the snow had stopped and the sun came out with the brilliant, blinding indifference of winter sun on fresh snow. Perry went to check the cattle, and she put on her sheepskin coat and followed him, because she had been inside 3 days, and she wanted the air, even if it was the kind of air that got into your lungs like cold water. He stopped and looked at her when she came out of the door. "You don't have to come," he said. "I know," she said. He turned and walked, and she walked beside him, and the snow was deep and hard going in places, and she sank to her knee once in a drift, and he caught her arm to steady her, and then kept hold of it, not proprietarily, not dramatically, just in the straightforward way of a man helping someone navigate difficult terrain, but he kept hold of it, and she did not pull away. And they walked out across the white meadow together in the brilliant January cold, with the mountains rising blue and enormous behind the pine ridge and the sky above them, the cleanest, deepest blue she had ever seen in her life. The cattle were fine, sheltered in the break behind the ridge as Perry had said. He counted them with the quick efficiency of a man who had been counting cattle for years, and she stood beside him and watched him do it, and then they walked back. And halfway back across the meadow he said, without looking at her, "It's beautiful country." "It is," she said. "I can see why you stayed." "I stayed because I claimed the land," he said. "At first. Later I stayed because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else." "That's the difference between surviving and living," she said. He looked at her then, walking beside her in the snow with his breath making small clouds in the cold air, and his expression was doing something she had not seen it do before. "Where did you come by that?" he asked. "Myself," she said. "A long time ago." Eli Prout returned from town the next morning, sheepish about having been stranded and laden with the news that Luther Hankins had fed him magnificently for 3 days, and that the post office had received a letter for Alice from her aunt in Philadelphia, which he produced from his coat pocket, somewhat crumpled. Alice read the letter at the kitchen table while Perry drank his coffee across from her. Her aunt wrote in the agitated, cramped hand of a woman who had been worried for months and was not finished worrying. She asked, was Alice safe? Was the man decent? Was the house warm? Was the country as rough as everyone said? Was there anyone to talk to? Was she eating properly? The letter ended with, "I miss you terribly, and I pray every night that you are not miserable." Alice read it twice and then set it down. "Good news?" Perry asked. "My aunt," she said. "She's worried." "Will you write back?" "Tonight," she said. "You should tell her to come visit in summer," Perry said. Alice looked up from the letter. "Really?" He was examining his coffee cup with more attention than it warranted. The ranch is presentable in summer, and it might put her mind at ease. Alice looked at him for a long moment. He was offering her something, a gesture toward the life she had left, a recognition that she had people she loved who loved her, an acknowledgement that her history did not end at the Wyoming territory line. It was such a quiet and deliberate thing, and it moved her more than a showy gesture would have. "Thank you," she said. "I'll tell her." March came in with mud and the smell of thaw, and the territory began its annual transformation from iron-hard white to the complicated, beautiful mess of early spring. The creek that ran along the south end of the property broke its ice and ran fast and brown with snowmelt, and the first grass appeared in the south-facing spots where the snow had gone thin, and the cattle moved with new energy across the pastures, and Eli Prout began whistling while he worked, which Alice had never heard him do before. She planted seeds in the kitchen garden. The ground was workable by mid-March in a good year, Perry told her, and she planned the rows with the methodical pleasure of someone who found deep satisfaction in putting things in the ground and watching what came up. She planted onions and carrots and turnips and beans and a section of kitchen herbs at the corner nearest the house, and Perry came by one afternoon and stood at the garden fence looking at what she had done. "You've expanded it," he said. "The old lines only used about half the space," she said, sitting back on her heels in the turned earth. She had dirt on her hands and across one cheek where she had pushed her hair back and had not noticed. "There's good depth here. This could be a genuinely productive kitchen garden with more variety." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother grew rosemary," he said, "in a pot because where we lived wasn't right for it in the ground. She kept it on the kitchen window ledge." Alice filed this away. The next time Eli went to town, he brought back a packet of rosemary seeds at her request. The thing between them was growing. She knew it, and she thought he knew it too, though she was careful not to press it or name it prematurely, because she had the sense that Perry Sullivan was like a wild thing that had learned by long experience that being approached too quickly was a reason to retreat, and she was patient. She had always been patient. It was perhaps the quality she was most confident of in herself. He began to talk to her more. Not a dramatic change, not suddenly becoming someone who liked to talk. He still wasn't that person, and she had no desire to change him. But the evenings by the fire became more conversational, and the mornings at the kitchen table stretched a little longer before he went out to work. And sometimes in the late afternoon when he came in, and she was in the kitchen, he would lean in the doorway and tell her about something that had happened in the day. A thing one of the cattle had done, or something Eli had said, or something about the land that had caught his attention. She told him about Philadelphia, about the millinery shop and the particular absurdity of fashionable women paying enormous sums for hats that served no function, about her aunt, who was fierce and funny, and had raised her with love and anxiety in equal measure, about the boarding house she had lived in, which had been clean and cheerless, and about the cold Philadelphia winters which she had endured without complaint, but which had never felt as beautifully, purely cold as Wyoming cold, which had a different quality, bigger, she said, more honest. He had liked that more honest, and she could see him turning the phrase over and storing it. One evening in April she was at the kitchen table writing in the journal she had kept since she was a girl, and he came in from the sitting room to refill his coffee and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "You keep a journal?" he asked. "Every day since I was 12, she said. "What do you write?" He asked it with genuine curiosity, not nosiness. "Everything," she said. "What happened, what I thought, what I felt, things I observed, sometimes things I want to remember." She looked at him. "Do you want to see it?" He shook his head quickly. "No, it's yours." He paused. "What did you write today?" She looked at the page, which he could not see from where he was standing. What she had written was, "He told me today that the South Meadow grass is coming in better this year than it has in 3 years." And while he said it, he was smiling, a real one, all the way to his eyes. "And I thought that I am beginning to understand what he looks like when he is happy, and that it is a remarkably fine thing to see. "Things I observed," she said. He nodded and refilled his coffee and went back to the sitting room, and she looked at the page for a moment longer and then wrote, "I think I am in danger of being very seriously in love with my husband, which was not what I expected when I came here, and is perhaps the most interesting thing that has happened to me in my life." The first time he touched her with anything like tenderness happened in the middle of May, without planning or ceremony, which was entirely in keeping with the kind of man he was. She had been attempting to fix the hinge on the root cellar door, which had worked loose over the winter and was beginning to give trouble. She had the right tools for it. She had located Perry's toolbox in the barn and knew what a hammer and a pry bar were, but the old hinge pin was rusted into its fittings and she could not get it to move, and she was crouched at the cellar door in the early morning, wrestling with it and working herself toward a frustration she was not going to admit to when Perry came around the side of the house. He stopped when he saw her. "What are you doing?" "The hinge is loose," she said. "I'm fixing it." He crouched down beside her, very close, their shoulders nearly touching, and looked at the problem. Without a word, he took the pry bar from her hand, repositioned it at a slightly different angle, and applied a brief, precise pressure, and the pin moved. "Angle," he said, handing the pry bar back. "I see that now," she said. They fixed the hinge together, him holding the pin in place while she drove it with the hammer, and at one point his hand was over hers on the handle for just a moment to guide the angle of the strike, and then he took it away, and neither of them mentioned it, but the contact had happened and it had been warm and certain, and she felt it long after his hand had moved. When they were done, he straightened up and looked at her. She had a smear of rust on her hands and what was probably several pieces of her hair coming loose from the knot at the back of her neck. "You didn't have to do this yourself," he said. "I didn't want to bother you," she said. "Alice." He said her name, and the way he said it was different from the way it had been said at the beginning, not the formal assessment of the first meeting, but something with weight in it, personal and careful. "You don't bother me." She looked up at him. The morning was warm and bright, the first truly warm morning of the year, and the smell of the thawing earth and the new grass was everywhere, and he was standing in front of her with those gray eyes doing the thing they sometimes did when he was not being careful, which was to express things he had not decided to say yet. "Good," she said, "because I plan to keep bothering you for a very long time." Something shifted in his face, a real shift, significant and clear, and before she could fully register it, he reached out and gently, carefully tucked a strand of her hair back behind her ear, the backs of his fingers barely brushing her cheek. It was over in a second, and then he stepped back and looked away, and she understood that this was enormous for him, and she did not make it into more than it was, just stood in the May morning with the warmth of it still on her face and thought, "There it is." Summer was glorious. The territory in summer was a different country entirely from what she had first seen in December. The meadows went deep green, and the cottonwoods filled with leaves that made a constant bright sound in the wind, and the creek ran clear and quick and cold, and the mountains changed color through the day from blue to purple to a deep rose at sunset that stopped her every time. The kitchen garden was producing beautifully better than she had hoped. The soil was rich and deep as she had guessed, and she put up preserves in systematic rotation, filling the root cellar shelves with a satisfaction that was almost physical. Her aunt arrived in July as Perry had suggested, on the stagecoach from Cheyenne. A small, energetic woman named Harriet who had the same dark hair as Alice and a frankness of manner that Perry, to Alice's quiet delight, seemed to respond to immediately. Harriet Townsend looked at the ranch for approximately 15 minutes and said to Alice, in the direct way she had always had, "Well, it's real, isn't it? I mean genuinely real. A real place and real work and a real life." "Yes," Alice said, "that's exactly what it is." Harriet watched Perry come in from the corral one morning and wash his hands at the pump and nod to her before going to pour his coffee, and she said to Alice later in the kitchen while Perry was out of earshot, "He's very contained." "He is," Alice agreed. "But he looks at you," Harriet said. Alice turned from the stove. "What do you mean?" "When you're not looking at him," Harriet said. "He looks at you in a way that would probably embarrass him severely if he knew anyone had noticed." "I noticed." Alice was quiet for a moment, something warm moving through her chest. "He's careful," she said. "He's frightened," Harriet said, not unkindly. "But the good ones usually are." Harriet stayed 3 weeks, and by the end of it she had beaten Perry at chess twice, which he had allowed with very good grace, and had taught Eli Prout to make an edible apple cake, and had made peace with Wyoming in the way that people who are essentially practical make peace with places that are essentially honest, by acknowledging that it is exactly what it says it is. When Harriet left on the stagecoach back to Cheyenne, Perry stood beside Alice and watched the stage roll down the main street of Harrow Creek and then said, "She's a good woman." "She is," Alice said. "She raised me." "I can see that," he said, which was the nicest thing he had said to Alice since they met, and she suspected he knew it. The moment that broke the last wall came on a Saturday evening in early September. Doc Mercer, a lean, thoughtful man of 60 with steady hands and a dry wit, had invited them both to supper, which was apparently unprecedented enough that Luther Hankins mentioned it to Perry in a tone of mild amazement when Perry came in for supplies that week. Mercer entertained chess partners and the occasional colleague passing through from Cheyenne, but he was as private in his way as Perry, and a dinner invitation was not a thing he extended freely. The dinner was good. Mercer kept a surprisingly sophisticated larder, and the conversation was better, because Mercer was the kind of man whose curiosity was vast and genuine, and he asked Alice about Philadelphia with a real interest in the answer, and he and Perry talked about the territory's economics, and the cattle market, and the question of whether Wyoming would achieve statehood within the next decade, in the way of two men who had been arguing about these things companionably for years. Walking back to the ranch in the September night, they had taken the wagon, and Perry drove while Alice sat beside him on the seat. The temperature had dropped and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always were in that country, so numerous and bright they seemed almost aggressive. She was cold despite the sheepskin coat, and after a while, naturally and without announcement, she moved closer to him on the seat and he put one arm around her, entirely without comment, as though it were something they had always done. She rested her head against his shoulder. The horse moved at a steady walk. The stars swung overhead. The land was dark and enormous around them and completely without threat. After a while he said quietly, "Alice." "Yes." A pause. She could feel the change in his breathing, the slight tension that meant he was working up to something, and she waited. "I know this was an arrangement," he said, "and I know I didn't offer much in the letter. I didn't have the words for what I wanted. I'm not sure I knew what I wanted." She waited. "I know now," he said, "what I want." She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark, his profile against the stars, the firm lines of his face in which she had learned by now to read everything he could not simply say. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her, and in the darkness his gray eyes were very clear and very serious. "You," he said, what you've made here, out of very little I gave you to work with." Alice felt the words land somewhere deep in her chest where she kept the things that mattered. "You gave me more than you know," she said. "I'm going to do better," he said. "I want to do better. I'm not easy, I know that." "Perry," she said, "I did not come 2,000 miles looking for easy. I came looking for real." She put her hand against his jaw, her palm against the cold skin of his face, and felt him hold absolutely still in the way of someone who is receiving something they had not allowed themselves to expect. "This is real," she said. "You are real, and I'm entirely yours if you want me." He turned his face slightly into her hand, the smallest motion, almost a reflex, and then he said very quietly, "I want you. I have wanted. I think I began wanting from the moment you told me. You did not say things you could not do." She laughed, a real laugh, soft in the night air, and he looked at her with that look she had catalogued and treasured, the one that was everything he did not know how to say, and then he kissed her. It was nothing like the wedding kiss, nothing formal or cold or brief about it. It was slow and deliberate and warm, the kiss of a man who had decided something and was entirely committed to his decision. And she kissed him back with everything she had been keeping careful for 9 months, and the horse walked placidly onward beneath the extravagant Wyoming stars, and did not need to be told where home was. In the weeks that followed, the house changed. Not the structure of it, the pine table and the stone fireplaces and the sheepskin coat by the back door, remained exactly where they were, but the feeling of it, the air inside it. Perry came in from work in the evenings and sought her out, not dramatically, just the natural movement of a man toward the person he wanted to be near. He began to touch her in small, accumulating ways, a hand at her back when they passed in the kitchen, fingers brushing hers when she handed him something, sitting beside her in the evenings on the settee instead of in his separate chair. He talked to her more. The things he had kept for years in the private rooms of himself, he began to open, slowly and in his own order, and she received each thing carefully and set it in the right place and gave nothing back that he had not given her room to keep. She told him things in return, her fears, her loneliness in Philadelphia, the way she had sometimes felt as if she were made of a material too practical and too plain for the decorative life women were supposed to want. And he listened to all of it with the absolute attention he gave to everything he considered important, which she had begun to understand was his highest form of regard. One November evening, a year almost exactly since her arrival, she was at the kitchen stove and he came up behind her and put his arms around her, just held her, his chin against her hair, and she set down her spoon and covered his hands with hers, and they stood like that for a long moment in the warm kitchen with the smell of the supper around them and the fire going and the wind outside doing its winter work, and she thought that she had been right to come. She had been right about everything. "I love you," he said, into her hair quietly, as though he was not entirely sure his voice would cooperate, but he had decided to say it regardless. She turned in his arms and looked at him, at the gravity and the uncertainty and the enormous, guarded, genuine feeling in his gray eyes, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating, steady and real. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for a while." "How long?" he asked. "Since the blizzard," she said. "Maybe before." "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it when you were ready," she said. "That's worth more than saying it sooner." He pulled her close and she tucked her face against his neck, and he held her in the kitchen with the supper going and the November wind at the windows. And this was, she thought, exactly what a sound roof and a real life felt like from the inside. Winter came again, the second winter, and it was different in every way from the first, because they came to it together and as themselves, without the careful contractual distance of strangers. Perry taught her to ride properly. She had managed the bay horse behind him but could not handle a horse alone with any confidence, and he was a patient teacher, which surprised her a little until she remembered that patience was not the same as warmth, and he had always had patience, only pointed it at the land and the cattle rather than at people, because people had given him more reason than cattle to be guarded about it. She was riding the bay, whose name, she had learned, was Captain, by the end of October, and managing with genuine competence by December. And Perry had bought her a smaller horse at the Harrow Creek livestock auction in November, a calm gray mare named Iris, on the grounds that Captain was too big for everyday riding, and she should have a horse that was properly hers. She loved that mare with an immediate and uncomplicated affection, and Perry watched her with Captain with Iris, in the corral with an expression that was quietly and entirely happy. She had come to love that expression most. The quiet happiness, the kind that was not performed for anyone, that existed simply because it existed, because the man had found something he had not expected and did not quite know what to do with except be grateful for it. The Friday chess evenings with Doc Mercer became a regular feature of the winter, and sometimes Alice joined them, and sometimes she stayed home with her journal and her books, and either way was good, because she had no need to be beside him every moment. She was not that kind of love, the anxious kind that needed constant confirmation, But she was always glad when he came back through the door, and he was always glad to come back. Doc Mercer, who had known Perry Sullivan for 7 years and had never seen him look anything other than perfectly controlled, remarked to Alice one Friday over the chessboard while Perry was occupied with a move, "You've done something remarkable, Mrs. Sullivan." "I haven't done anything," Alice said. Mercer smiled at his chess pieces. "Precisely." In December, Alice discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for 3 weeks before she told Perry, not from fear of his reaction, but from the private habit of needing to be certain of things before she spoke them. When she was certain, she told him at the breakfast table on a Monday morning in mid-December, with the same straightforward simplicity she brought to everything. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In summer, I think, late June or July." He went very still. He was holding his coffee cup, and he set it down slowly on the table, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, unguarded in a way that was almost unprecedented for him, everything showing at once, the astonishment and the fear, and beneath both of those things something enormous and bright that she thought was joy. "Alice," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you, is this?" "Yes," he said before she could finish the question. He came around the table and she stood up and he held her with a force and a tenderness that told her everything she needed to know. "Yes," he said again into her hair. "God, yes." She laughed and held him back and felt the shake of his breathing against her shoulder. "It's all right," she said. "We're all right." "I know," he said. "I know we are." He was changed by the knowledge. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but perceptibly, in small and accumulating ways. He was even more careful of her than he had been, which she found both touching and occasionally excessive, and she told him so with a directness that made him smile. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said one afternoon in February when he had come in from the barn to check on her for the 3rd time that day, which she found both touching and faintly ridiculous. "I know that," he said. "Then stop coming in every 2 hours to look at me." "I'm not," I had a reason each time. "The first time I was thirsty. We have a pump in the barn specifically so you don't have to come in for water." He sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who has been found out and is not entirely ashamed of it. "All right," he said. "Maybe I was checking on you." "I'm fine," she said. "We're fine. Come in for supper and for the evenings, and that is sufficient." Alice, Perry, they looked at each other. He had that almost smile, the one she had catalogued the very first day. "You're very difficult to fuss over," he said. "Yes," she agreed pleasantly. "You knew that when you married me." Spring was a new country again, as it always was. The garden went in with expanded ambitions. She had ordered seeds from a supplier in Chicago through the mail, with Perry's encouragement, and had plans for a proper herb section, and a dedicated section of root vegetables, and a row of sunflowers along the west fence because she liked them, and there was no reason not to. Eli Prout had found himself a girl over the winter, a young woman named Clara Hobbs, whose family had a small farm 4 miles east of the Sullivan Ranch, a quiet person with a serious manner and a remarkable way with horses, and the change in Eli was both amusing and endearing. He arrived at work each morning slightly distracted and humming with a suppressed delight that even Perry had noticed. "He's in love," Alice said one evening, watching Eli through the kitchen window. "I know," Perry said from behind his book. "It's good for him," she said. Perry looked up. "It's good for anyone," he said, with a simplicity and conviction that made her turn around and look at him, and he looked back, and the knowing between them was warm and easy. Clara Hobbs became a frequent visitor that spring and summer, and Alice liked her genuinely. She was a practical, intelligent young woman who had read more books than most people in the county, and had strong opinions about horse breeding and Wyoming statehood and the proper way to cure a ham. And she and Alice spent several afternoons in the kitchen garden, talking in the contented way of women who have found that they think alike about the things that matter. On a Wednesday in late June, Alice's labor began in the early morning. Perry rode to town for Doc Mercer before the sun was fully up, and made the round trip in record time for a man who usually did not see the point of hurrying. And Mercer delivered the baby at noon in the east bedroom that had been Alice's through the first careful months and was now theirs. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with a full set of lungs and a quantity of dark hair and a set expression that made Doc Mercer laugh and say, "He knows what he's about, this one." Perry was allowed into the room when it was over, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at Alice, who was tired in the absolute, bone-deep way of a woman who has done the most demanding physical work of her life and knows she did it well. And then at the child in her arms, and his face went through something that Alice wished she could have preserved somehow, the way she preserved things in jars on the cellar shelves, because it was the most completely open expression she had ever seen him wear. "He's ours," he said quietly, as if the fact of it was almost more than he could hold. "He is," Alice said. "Come here." He sat on the edge of the bed, and she held the baby out, and he took him with the careful, concentrated exactness of a man who had never held a newborn before but was absolutely determined to do it right. The baby stopped making noise when Perry held him. He looked up at Perry's face with the unfocused gravity of new eyes, and Perry looked down at him, and the expression on Perry Sullivan's face in that moment was the farthest from cold that Alice had ever seen any person be. "What do we call him?" Perry asked. Alice had thought about names for months. She had a list. But looking at Perry's face, she said, "What was your mother's father's name?" Perry looked up at her. Something moved in his eyes, surprised, touched, deeply grateful. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Henry." "Thomas," Alice said. "Tom Sullivan." Perry looked down at the baby, who appeared to find the name satisfactory, or at least was not objecting. "Tom Sullivan," Perry said, and he said it the way he said things that mattered to him, quietly, precisely, meaning every syllable. The summer was the finest they had known. Tom Sullivan was a solid and healthy boy, who slept with a focus his father recognized and fed with an enthusiasm his mother appreciated, and who grew with the rapid commitment of a healthy thing in good soil. Alice recovered her strength within a few weeks and returned to the kitchen garden and the kitchen stove and the books by the fire in the evenings. And Perry carried Tom in the crook of his arm around the ranch with the completely unself-conscious pride of a man who has discovered a quality in himself he had not known was there. Eli Pruitt and Clara Hobbs were married in October of that year at the Cracked Bell Church in Harrow Creek, and Perry and Alice attended, and Perry stood beside Eli as his witness, which was, as Luther Hankins said later, the most warmly social thing Perry Sullivan had done in 8 years of living in the territory. And Eli looked so genuinely happy, it made Alice's eyes sting in the best possible way. At the reception afterward, held in the yard of the Hobbs family farm on a clear golden October afternoon, someone produced a fiddle, and a second person produced a harmonica, and dancing broke out in the organic, unself-conscious way of people who worked hard and took their celebrations seriously when they came. Alice was dancing with Clara when she saw Perry watching from the edge of the yard with Tom in his arms, and she went to him. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance," he said. "You've never tried," she said. "Alice, Perry." She looked at him with the particular look she had, calm and certain and not going anywhere, and she held out her hand. He looked at her hand, and then at her face, and then he handed Tom carefully to a nearby and very willing Harriet Townsend, who had returned for the winter and was discovering that she liked Wyoming territory considerably more than she had expected, and took Alice's hand. He was not a natural dancer. He was too deliberate in his movements for the loose-limbed ease that dancing required. But he held her correctly, and he kept time, and he did not let go, and she danced with her husband in the golden October afternoon, while the fiddle played and the mountains watched, and his gray eyes were on her face the whole time with that expression she loved most, the quiet and enormous happiness that was not for anyone but her. Tom took his first steps in February of the following year, lurching across the kitchen floor with an expression of concentrated determination that made Perry and Alice both stop what they were doing and watch with the suspended breathlessness of new parents, encountering a miracle they know is ordinary and cannot help finding extraordinary regardless. He crossed the kitchen floor, 4 steps, 5, 6, and crashed into Perry's knees and grabbed his trouser legs for balance, and looked up at his father with a triumphant expression identical to the one Alice made when she had done something well. Perry reached down and scooped him up and held him at arm's length and then close, and Tom laughed, a full delighted sound that rang around the kitchen, and Alice stood at the stove with her hands pressed to her mouth, and thought that this was the life she had not known she was capable of imagining when she had been alone in a Philadelphia boarding house reading an advertisement that offered a sound roof and no patience for nonsense. The following spring, Eli Prout came to Perry with the news that Clara was expecting, and Perry shook his hand in the firm, spare way he showed affection, and told him he could have the south pasture cabin to live in with his family if he wanted it, because the south pasture cabin had been empty for 5 years and was sound enough to set right with a few weeks of work. And Eli went slightly red around the ears in the way of a young man who has not expected generosity and does not quite know how to handle it, and said thank you in a voice that was not entirely steady. Alice overheard this from the kitchen window. She waited until Perry came inside and then she said, "That was a kind thing." "It was a practical thing," he said. "I need Eli close and the cabin's wasting." "Perry," he looked at her. "It was kind," she said. "Let it be kind." He held her gaze for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "It was kind," he said. "Thank you," she said. They set the south pasture cabin right over the course of April, all of them together, Perry and Eli doing the heavy work of patching and repairing, Alice and Clara whitewashing the inside walls and making curtains from flour sack fabric, Tom underfoot, and entirely convinced he was helping. By the end of April, the cabin was warm and tight and habitable, and Eli and Clara moved in with a happiness that was so straightforward and complete it was a pleasure to be near. The year Tom was 3, Alice discovered she was pregnant again. She told Perry at the kitchen table again in the same straightforward way, and his response was the same, the stillness, and then the enormous, unguarded warmth, though this time without the astonishment, replaced by a deep and uncomplicated joy. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He put his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window over the sink, the one that faced the mountains, in the particular way it did in early spring, clean and slant and very bright. And she thought about the first morning she had made breakfast in this kitchen, and how strange and careful and distant everything had been, and how impossibly far away that felt now. That winter, Harriet Townsend had come to stay again. She had been coming every winter since the first visit, had developed what amounted to a second life in Harrow Creek, had become a regular chess opponent of Doc Mercer's, and had expressed opinions on the territory's land management that Luther Hankins said were the most sensible things he had heard in 10 years, and it was Harriet who sat with Alice through the labor, and Harriet who held Tom's hand in the kitchen while Perry stayed with Alice and the doctor worked, and Harriet who heard the second cry and said to Tom quietly, "There's your sibling." Tom, who was 3.5 and entirely his father's son in terms of processing significant information with minimal visible reaction, said, "Is it mine?" "It is," Harriet said. "Good," said Tom, and went back to his wooden horse. The second child was a girl, and she came into the world with the same decisive air as her brother, but with a set of lungs that made the doctor blink. Alice named her Catherine for her mother, who had been gone for 16 years but was not forgotten, and Perry held her in his arms the same way he had held Tom, with the same concentrating care, and looked at Alice with those gray eyes that could contain multitudes if he let them. "Hello, Catherine," he said to the baby in his arms. "We've been waiting for you." Catherine, who was 6 hours old and extremely new to everything, regarded him with the slightly crossed, earnest gaze of the newly arrived, and Perry touched her cheek with one finger very gently, and she latched onto the finger with her whole small hand, and that was that. By the time Catherine was walking, Tom was in his first year of the lessons that Alice conducted at the kitchen table every morning, because the Harrow Creek schoolhouse was 4 miles away, and Tom was 5 and Perry had driven Alice past the schoolhouse on a winter day, and they had agreed without extensive discussion that Alice's kitchen table was more than capable of meeting the educational needs of a 5-year-old, and that when he was older they would reassess. Alice taught well. She had been learning her whole life, and she knew the difference between information presented and knowledge genuinely transferred. And Tom was an attentive and serious student with a particular fascination for mathematics, which he approached with the same methodical precision his father applied to everything, and a surprising love of stories, which he had from his mother. Catherine, who was 18 months younger and not yet at the table for lessons, nonetheless managed to be present for most of them, sitting on the kitchen floor with a collection of wooden blocks and a firm conviction that she was participating. Perry watched the morning lessons from the doorway sometimes, between going to the barn and going to the south pasture, and Alice would catch him there and he would look caught and go, and she would smile and continue with Tom. One morning she did not pretend not to notice and simply said, "You could pull up a chair." He did. He sat at the end of the kitchen table while Alice taught Tom about fractions, and Catherine climbed on his knee and arranged blocks in patterns that she narrated to herself quietly. And it was perhaps the most completely Perry Sullivan had ever looked like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The year Catherine was 4 and Tom was 6, Wyoming Territory became Wyoming the state. It was admitted to the Union on July 10, 1890, and the news reached Harrow Creek by telegraph 3 hours later. Luther Hankins rang the church bell. It cracked on the third ring as it always did, and a spontaneous gathering formed on the main street that turned into a street supper by evening, with tables pulled out and food brought from homes, and the Broken Spur contributing a quantity of respectable whiskey, and even more respectable lemonade for those who preferred it. Perry and Alice sat at a long table with Doc Mercer and Eli and Clara Prout, Clara carrying their second child, a healthy boy named James who was 4 months old and deeply interested in the proceedings, and Luther Hankins and his wife, and the Reverend Oakes who had married Perry and Alice what felt like a very long time ago now, and who raised his glass with the rest of them when the toasts were made. Perry had Tom on his knee and one hand on Alice's, and when the sun went down and the lanterns came out and the fiddle appeared again from wherever it lived in Harrow Creek, he said to Alice quietly, "I want to say something to you." She looked at him. "I know I am not effusive," he said. The word cost him something, she could tell, not because it was untrue, but because he was making himself speak about something he found difficult to speak about. "I know that there are things I feel that I have been slow to say, and that you have never demanded them, which is," he stopped, continued, "which is one of the things about you that I am most grateful for, but I want you to know," his hand tightened on hers, "this life, all of this." He looked at Tom, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder, and at Catherine in Alice's lap, and at the lights and the people of the town where they lived in the new state of Wyoming. "I would not have known how to want this before you came. I did not know what it was, and you didn't demand it from me. I just stayed," she said. "You just stayed," he said, "and were yourself, entirely yourself, and somewhere in that I became someone different, someone better. You were always good," she said. "I was alone," he said. "That is not the same thing." She looked at him, at the fire-lit face of the man she had crossed half a continent to find and had discovered, over the course of one transforming winter and the years that followed, to be everything she had understood from a sparse and unpretentious letter, that he was going to be honest, real, reliable, and capable of something larger than he knew. "Perry Sullivan," she said. "Alice Sullivan," he returned. She leaned across the table and kissed him, there in the lamplight with the fiddle playing and their children sleeping against them, and the new state of Wyoming stretching in every direction around them. And he kissed her back with the absolute certainty of a man who has learned, slowly and by the best possible teacher, that the things he was most afraid of losing were the things most worth holding. Tom woke up enough to observe this with the bleary dignity of a 6-year-old and said, "Are we going home?" "Soon," Perry said. "Is there more cake?" Tom asked. "Probably," Alice said. "Good," Tom said and went back to sleep. Catherine, who was asleep in Alice's lap and therefore not required to have opinions, had no comment. The years that followed were full. The ranch expanded. Perry bought the adjacent property when its owner, an aging bachelor named Horace Webb, decided to retire to Cheyenne in 1892, and the Sullivan land went to 480 acres and needed another hand, which led to the arrival of a young man from Nebraska named George Alden, who was 21 and quiet and capable, and who, within 2 years, had developed a visible regard for a girl named Sylvia Ransom who helped at the Hankins store on weekdays, and whose courtship played out with a transparent sweetness that provided considerable entertainment for everyone in a 3-mile radius. Alice began teaching at the Harrow Creek schoolhouse on Tuesdays and Thursdays when Tom was 7, because the schoolteacher who had come from Denver the year before left after one Wyoming winter, and the school had no replacement, and Alice had 2 good teaching days to give, and she gave them. She taught arithmetic and reading and a little science and a great deal of history, and her students ranged from 5 to 14 and ranged in attentiveness from rapt to aggressively absent, and she was good at it. She was good at everything she set herself to do, which Perry acknowledged openly and without any of the discomfort men often felt about capable women, because he was not a man who feared competence, only nonsense, and Alice Townsend Sullivan was many things, but nonsense was not among them. When Tom was 8, he decided he wanted to learn everything about the land, the cattle, the fences, the creek, the seasonal patterns of the pasture, all of it, and Perry taught him with the patience and precision he brought to everything he considered important, which was the highest tribute he could pay, and Tom absorbed it all with the focused intensity of someone who has found the subject that is his. He was going to be a rancher. Anyone could see it by the time he was 10. Catherine, who was her mother's daughter in many ways, was nonetheless entirely her own person, determined, curious, occasionally infuriating in the best possible way, with a gift for drawing that she had discovered at age 5 and pursued with the single-minded commitment of someone who has found their language. Perry built her a table of her own in the sitting room where the light was good, and she sat there most evenings with her pencils and her paper and produced drawings of the ranch, the mountains, the horses, the cattle, the people she knew, with a quality of observation that made Alice think, consistently and with deep pleasure, that this girl was going to make something of herself in whatever direction she turned. In the autumn of 1893, Alice found she was expecting for the 3rd time. She told Perry on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, the usual way, and he stood up from the table and held her without saying anything for a long time, which was its own answer, complete and sufficient. The 3rd child arrived in spring, another boy, healthy and loud and determined. They named him Henry, for Perry's grandfather on his mother's side. The name came from the Whitman book, in a way, because Perry had said one evening that when his mother read the poetry, she always said his grandfather was the one who had given her the book, and that Henry was a name worth keeping. Henry Sullivan came into the world in April, when the first green was just coming back to the meadow and the creek was high with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were beginning to bud, and the house was full to a degree it had not been before, and was better for it. Tom was 9 when Henry arrived and took his new brother's existence with the serious responsibility he brought to most things, appointing himself a kind of junior guardian that no one had asked him to be and everyone appreciated. Catherine, who was 7, was less interested in the baby as a baby and more interested in drawing him, which she did with an accuracy that the baby did not appreciate, and everyone else found remarkable. Perry looked at his family in the kitchen one evening that spring, Tom doing his sums at the table, Catherine at her drawing table in the sitting room visible through the open door, Alice nursing Henry by the stove, the smell of supper hanging in the warm air, the May evening coming in gold through the kitchen window, and Alice watched him look, and watched the expression he wore while he did. There was no coldness in it. There was no distance, no careful arrangement of a face that had decided not to give itself away. There was just a man looking at the life he had built and had been given and had chosen, every part of it, with an openness that was entirely at peace with itself. He met her eyes. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm looking at you." "You're always looking at me," he said with that almost smile. "You're worth looking at," she said. He crossed the kitchen and crouched beside her chair and looked at Henry, who had fallen asleep at her side in the way of very new babies who cannot keep consciousness for long. Then he looked at Alice, close, in the way he had developed over years of marriage of looking at her when they were near direct and full and without reservation, as though the years had worn away every instinct he'd once had to guard himself from being too clearly seen. "I used to think," he said quietly so as not to wake Henry, "that I was better suited to being alone, that it was what I was made for, the land, the work, the quiet." "I remember," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "Not about the land or the work, but about the alone." He touched her face, the same gesture as that May morning years ago in the yard with the root cellar hinge, the backs of his fingers against her cheek, though there was nothing tentative in it now. "I was wrong about that." "You were just waiting," she said. "You didn't know you were waiting." "What was I waiting for?" he asked, with the slight tilt of the voice that meant he knew the answer and wanted to hear her say it. "For someone too practical to be put off by a cold man," she said. He laughed, a real one, full, the laugh she had worked for and earned and now heard often enough that it no longer surprised her but still delighted her every time. And then he kissed her on the temple and stood up and went to put more wood on the kitchen stove, because the evening was cooling and the house needed tending, and there was work to do, and that was the shape of it. That was always the shape of it. Love in the doing of ordinary things, in the morning coffee left on the back of the stove, in the hand offered across difficult terrain, in the patience that asked nothing and was given everything. Love that had been built slowly and deliberately and honestly, the way the man himself had built everything worth having in his life, a fence post at a time, a wall at a time, with good materials and no patience for nonsense, until it was solid enough to last any winter. The Sullivan Ranch in Wyoming, in the years that followed, became the kind of place people pointed to when they talked about what the territory had been and what the state was becoming, not because it was the largest or the most prosperous, though it was respectable on both counts, but because it had about it the quality of a place genuinely and completely inhabited. The fences were straight and the cattle were well kept, and the kitchen garden was the finest in the county, and the light in the windows at evening was warm and constant, and anyone who came to it, for business or for friendship, or just because they happened to be passing the long road between Harrow Creek and the mountains, felt something when they came through the gate. Tom Sullivan grew into his father's height and his mother's sharpness, and worked the land with a love for it that was entirely his own. Catherine Sullivan's drawings appeared one year in a Cheyenne paper, and were spoken of as remarkable, and she went at 17 to study in Denver, and returned to Wyoming every summer with new eyes for the country she had grown up in. Henry Sullivan, the spring child, grew up quick and sociable and funny, and became the kind of person around whom things happened, events, laughter, plans, and Perry watched all three of them with the quiet astonishment of a man who still found it genuinely remarkable that he had built something so large and so alive from what had been, before a winter morning in December 1882, a 340-acre cattle ranch, and a silence too big to fill alone. Alice Townsend Sullivan sat beside her husband on the porch on a September evening in the last years of the century, in the last light of a day that had been perfectly ordinary, and therefore perfectly fine. The cattle seen to, the children fed, the dishes washed, Henry asleep and Tom in the barn and Catherine upstairs with her pencils and her paper. And the mountains were doing the thing they did at that hour, going rose and purple in the long western light. And the cottonwoods made their bright sound in the cooling air, and the ranch lay out before them in the dusk, solid and cared for and entirely theirs. Perry had his arm around her and she leaned into him with the ease of years, her head against his shoulder, watching the mountains change color. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" he said. "About the letter," she said. "The first letter, what you wrote." He was quiet for a moment. "That letter was not my finest work," he said. She smiled. "It was honest." "It was inadequate," he said. "It said what you could say at the time," she said. "That's enough." He turned his head and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she felt the warmth of it, familiar as the house around her, as the sound of the creek in its banks, as the smell of pine and grass and the particular clean cold that came with the first breath of evening in the territory. She had learned the country the way she had learned the man, slowly, and then all at once, and then so thoroughly that she could not separate her knowledge of it from her knowledge of herself. "What would you write now?" she asked. "If you were writing the letter now." He considered this for a long time, in the way he considered things honestly and without hurry, because he had learned that words were worth the time they took. "I would write," he said slowly, "that I have 340 acres and sound fences and a kitchen garden that is the finest in the county, and 3 children who are better people than I had any right to produce, and a warmth in this house that did not exist before you came and will not leave as long as you are in it." He paused. "And I would write that if she is willing to come, she should come at once, because whatever she is looking for, I believe we will find it together." Alice was quiet for a moment. The mountains went deeper into their evening colors, rose fading to violet, violet to a deep and breathing blue. "I would have come," she said. "I know," he said. "Faster even," she said. He laughed, soft in the September evening, and she laughed with him, and they sat on the porch of their house in their state in the good last light, and the life they had built together was entirely around them, solid as timber and stone, and nothing in it was cold.